everyone. Welcome to Bible study. Remember, we are asking for you to share your questions, share your concerns, and the hope is that I won't answer them without careful consideration. I'll go to multiple sources. And in our Torah Tuesday, there was a question that concerned the Red Letter Bible series. Has anybody ever heard about the Red Letter Bible? Jeff, have you ever heard about a Red Letter Bible?
Oh, red what?
Red Letter Bible.
No.
It's a Bible that has the words of Jesus
Oh, highlighted?
Oh,
printed in
Oh,
red.
yes, I did, yes,
And
I'm
all
sorry.
the rest of the
Yeah.
So you
Bible.
can tell it's his voice.
Exactly.
I like that a lot.
the
Exactly.
Masonic Bible has that.
All the other words are in black or in blue,
I prefer
depending
that way. I like it that
on
way.
a white
Mine
page.
was like that.
Now, does anybody have one of those, or you've probably used one from time to time? They've been around since 1899, and this fellow by the name of Mr. Klops, Charles Klops, he produced the first one, and he was the editor of a magazine called the Christian Herald. Christian Herald. He was what they call a Christian evangelist. Oh, now you look all formal.
Yes,
You
ma'am.
could join us anyway.
Yes, ma'am.
So
Now
this
you're
was
making me look bad.
talking about red letter Bibles. Some people absolutely love them, but some people see problems with
How
a
could
red
it be
letter
problems? I
Bible.
think that's a total benefit, so you know exactly what voice that is.
Except the question is, who decides what gets written in red? You know, who decides? Because we know.
He must have been approved then if he did it.
Yeah.
He had to.
Well,
have
in the red letter Bible, the editors of the book decide. So it's not necessarily a committee, it's not the Pope and the councils and, now for us today, and this is what we were talking about on Tuesday, I think the issue with red letter Bibles, for us as Christians, is that, especially us at this table, don't we believe that the whole Bible is God inspired? Not necessarily, but how about this? God breathed, right? God breathes the Bible. We breathe it in, we see other people, we breathe, they breathe, we exchange that spirit. That's the spirit of Christianity, I think, or the spirit of God, which doesn't have to be just Christian, right? It happened before the word Christian became popular, but it's the same idea. We breathe in just the way God breathed into us at creation, and then we share that. Now it was funny because the question came it was rather peculiar. She was watching a political pundit on television. His name was Joe Scarborough. He has a morning show apparently, and he was quoting Jesus from his red letter Bible. And that was the same day after I had made the statement about what I had been taught in divinity school, which is, and I know this bothered some people in here, not one author of the New Testament ever met Jesus personally. Not one author ever saw Jesus face to face. You have to think about that. None of them knew Jesus because none of them had ever met Jesus. So how could there be a red letter Bible? How could they say, there were no recordings, there were no scribes, no stenos, right? So there was no epissima vox or epissima verba, the exact voice of Jesus in Latin or the exact words of Jesus. So that information couldn't be verified. And also, everything in the Bible is important, I think, not just what Jesus said, right? But when I said that a few weeks ago, it disturbed me to see the looks on some of your faces, because that statement was obviously disturbing to some of you, and that disturbs me. What do you mean that Jesus didn't say that? And I didn't say that Jesus didn't say that. I said it's not verifiable. Not verifiable. So I want you to know that just because I tell you what someone else told me does not mean that what I say is the only way to read the Bible or to evaluate what you read. At no time does anything that I say or anyone else says, it should never make the Bible more difficult for you to read, or disturbing.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, of
I'm
course.
sorry, but so prior to the Gospels being written, it was all oral history?
Well, actually, it was Paul. He wrote. Now, Paul never met Jesus, but we know he met Peter, who knew Jesus. So Peter had stories, and Paul heard the stories, and so that is correct.
So
There
then-
were stories about Jesus.
Would have the apostles been literate, or would have they?
Still arguing.
Okay.
Still arguing about that. That's why those letters that I said, 1st and 2nd Peter, Peter couldn't possibly have written those because Peter didn't have Greek. He didn't.
Yeah,
And they're written in Greek. But does that mean that Peter couldn't have spoken them in Aramaic and somebody wrote them in Greek? So are they Peter's letters? So those are the kinds of
So
questions.
Matthew, like Matthew,
Matthew seems to have been very well educated rabbinically.
but he was along with Jesus, right?
Yeah, and he was a
was.
tax collector, and we
Right,
think he was
right.
probably trained as a rabbi, so he
Okay.
probably had Hebrew, he probably had Aramaic, and because he was working, he probably had some koine, some Greek too.
the general Jewish population then at that time, what percentage of them do you think were literate?
Much more than we think. We thought they were basically
many.
all illiterate, but we think they were far more illiterate. But that's a recent development. And we're learning that through other documents, what they call extra biblical documents that don't have anything to do with the Roman Empire, and Greek influence, Hellenization of the Roman Empire, but not necessarily the Bible.
But oral history, people were trained as oral historians so that the story didn't change. It was.
Oh, it changed, but yes, they were trained without a doubt. Because why wouldn't it change? Why wouldn't it change?
Stories of
The
old,
stories
like
of-
like
the stories of old.
like the Indians.
It was
It
word
was
for
word
word.
for word, and people were.
That's
picked
right,
For
that's right,
the
but-
memory that they could carry on word for
absolutely, and
word.
I agree with you, the person who was telling that story knew that story. That's why so much of the ancient hymns and prayers are poems, because it's easier to memorize a poem than it is
Mhm.
just random sentences. But of course, we know the problem with oral history. The person telling the story doesn't change, but the person retelling the story changes the story depending on to whom he is telling the story. And that's just human nature.
But you do that when you're writing, as a teacher, you speak differently to your students, especially if you have younger children, than you do to their parents or to your fellow teachers. It's a different language that you use because the knowledge that they have is more or less. So, that's just part of communicating. that you-
Right, and that was my next point. The Bible does exactly the same thing. The Bible speaks in many, many voices, so we should hear all the voices that are speaking in the Bible. But first, I want to get to what Scott was talking about. Who wrote the New Testament. And the point is, and don't get crazy now, we don't know who wrote the New Testament. Now, does that upset you to hear? We don't really know who wrote it. We know all the books have names. We know there's the Gospel of Mark and Matthew, and there's Acts, and there's Revelation. There's an author stated for each one of the books. The Gospel of Mark is written by Mark. But
Who's
Mark who?
Yeah, who's Mark?
Who exactly is
And
Mark?
who said it's Mark?
Yeah.
Why?
Well, it says, we can read that. It says, the Gospel of Mark.
Where did that come, when was that?
That was the earliest gospel, and we're gonna talk about that chronologically. And we know Matthew, we know John, but did the same John who wrote the gospel, the fourth gospel, did he also write the book of Revelation? You know, John of Patmos, is he John the Apostle? Are they the same? We honestly don't know for certain. Now, does that upset anybody?
No.
But listen to this for a second.
It's upsetting because if you have been taught all your life X, Y, Z,
Right.
and then you're learning that, well, maybe X, Y, Z isn't exactly correct. There's a period of adjustment there to say, okay, it's all right that, but I was taught younger or at a different time is not necessarily exactly the truth. Not that it's a lie, but it's just there's more information available than there was when I learned it.
Right, and I think that's a good thing. If you've been taught all your life that black people are stupid, they're not as smart, that's why they're in the position they're in. That's why they don't dress properly, and that's why they go topless in their communities. If you've been taught all your life that black people are ignorant, and now, don't you think it's a good thing that we know
Yeah.
that? Yeah, so it's interesting to re-examine what we thought we knew. And, you know, once again, I go back to God in the Garden of Eden with Adam. Who told you you were naked? Where'd you get that? You know, I never mentioned it. There's no other way you could look at yourself. Who told you this? And we have to do that on a regular basis. We've got to check what we're wearing and what we're thinking and what we're hearing. But let's look at Paul, because I think he's one of the most interesting, and that's what we're gonna talk about at Seaside Springs the next time we get together. We know that Paul wrote letters, right? He wrote letters to churches, and he wrote 13 of them, but only 7 of those letters are undisputed letters. The other ones were probably not written by Paul. They were probably written by people who knew Paul, or who followed Paul, or who agreed with Paul. Sometimes not. But what about the letters by Peter? Were those written by Peter? Scholars say, no chance. Now, how can I say that? And trust me, it's not me saying that. Almost always, and here's another thing we have to understand. Almost always, for every person who says Peter did not write those letters, there's another person right here who says very clearly, Peter definitely wrote those letters. You know, if it's in the Bible, it means what it says what it means. So what do we do with information like that? Can we trust what we read? And I think that's exactly what we're supposed to do. I think we're supposed to trust that we can't do this on our own. We need the Holy Spirit, and we really need each other. We need to exchange information. We need to look at things. We need to explain what we heard, because we know the same story. I mean, if you grew up in a house with brothers and sisters, you know, and your mother comes home and says, what the heck happened here? There were 3 of us in the house, 3 different stories. It was him, it was her, you know. the Bible is an open book, so we should keep it open, so we can hear all the messages. Now, we just talked about the earliest part of the New Testament. And what was the earliest part? What is the earliest part of the New Testament?
Matthew that comes first.
Mark comes first, right?
I think
Even though it's not written this way, or
In Mark.
not positioned, the earliest writings are the letters of Paul.
Really?
Yeah, definitely, the epistles. They were written by Paul and by people who followed Paul. And people say that Paul's letters were probably written around 30 years, somewhere in that vicinity after Jesus died. Where Mark wasn't written until at least 50, sometimes people think later. So Paul was really, so think about it, Paul knew Peter. They didn't get along and they didn't like each other, and unfortunately they both went out tragically, horribly. Paul was beheaded and Peter was crucified upside down because they believed in Jesus. So Paul heard firsthand from people, from the apostles. He knew the apostles, but he never met Jesus except in his dream and on his way to Damascus. And we know that Paul wrote to churches that had issues, and he also wrote to churches who had a lot of money, because Paul needed a lot of money because he was a missionary. He had work to do. He had to travel, and he had an entourage, sort of a posse that followed him to help Christianize the churches that he visited. So Paul wrote a lot of stewardship letters. And then by the end of the first century, oh, of course, no worries, all of Paul's letters were compiled, and they were labeled Paul's letters or Paul's epistles. But I think it's interesting, if you ever take the time to just read through them. A lot of them are very short, not all of them. Paul could talk, but you don't get to read a lot about Jesus himself, because they don't say a lot about Jesus himself. Of course, Jesus is in there, and he's very important, but Paul doesn't give us many clear-cut facts about our Lord and Savior. Probably because Paul is writing to specific churches about very specific problems. But even so, sometime all these letters were compiled, they were grouped, and when you read them one after the other, you can kind of see that there are different traditions grouped together. In Rome, the church was doing things and feeling things different than Ephesus, or different than in Thessalonica, and different in Corinth. You know, these traditions. And you'll also read a lot of popular sayings. Like, what's that Ben Franklin?
Early to rise makes a man.
Yeah, but that book that he was, Poor Richard's Almanac. You know, where Franklin would write, God, I've been in Franklin with the Declaration of Independence. It's so funny. But yes, Paul heard these statements and he used these statements. Not early to bed though, but you reap what you sow. But people didn't say that just about Jesus. They said it about everything. But Paul took it and used it.
But isn't that kind of in Proverbs? I mean, that kind of.
There's
sayings.
wisdom,
Yeah.
wisdom sayings without a doubt. And they're ancient. People have been saying them forever. And this one that your mother, I'm sure, told you, bad company ruins your good morals, right? If you lay down with dogs, or blah, blah, blah. But my favorite one that Paul uses, and he uses it often, give thanks for everything. And Paul used a lot of parables. which are stories with a message, we know, where something stands for something else, allegorically, symbolically. And sometimes you really can't understand what Jesus is trying to say in the parable. It just doesn't make much sense. In fact, I'm going to preach just a little bit on that this Sunday. I don't know if you know the Bratty Kids parable. It's in Mark's gospel. Oh, you gotta come. It's
I hope so.
Yeah,
I really hope so.
I hope so too. So after you read a parable by Jesus, you usually say, "What in the world does this mean?" And that's when you hear Jesus say, "That's right. I told that story specifically so no one would understand it." And then you're going, why did he say that? You know, how many times did we read that in Mark just recently? I told that so that only children would understand it, not you dumb disciples. But then Jesus usually goes on to explain it, and Paul definitely explains what Jesus means. In fact, sometimes my friends who aren't Christian, they might say, you know, Donna, what you're talking about there is so much more Pauline than it is Christian. That's not what Christ said and meant and taught and preached. That's what Paul said, not Christ. Christ never said blah, 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 and we can argue about it all the time. Are you a Pauline or are you a Christian? But Paul wrote a lot of formulas, which was a way, a direction that the readers in the church were supposed to follow. Like Paul would write a rejoice formula for a church like our church, like Nicomas. You are doing a great job, keep up the great work. But he had petition formulas, repent and ask God for forgiveness. But all of that just gets packaged in the first part of the New Testament. But I have a question. When you read that, are you okay? Do you ever ask yourself, where did Paul get this stuff? Do you think that Paul knew Jesus face to face, in your opinion? Do you think that Jesus told Paul what to write in those letters? Don't they seem close though?
I think Paul had spent a lot of time with Jesus after he, you know,
Died?
after he died
Oh.
and came back. I think that
Wait.
Well,
Oh,
it's
after the resurrection.
that's when Paul came into. Isn't
Jesus
that-
had already ascended.
Huh?
Jesus had already
Yeah, but
ascended.
he came back.
He hasn't come back yet. We're still waiting for the second
No.
coming.
Didn't he come back for like 40 days or sometime? The disciples saw him. He was in that room. I mean, he didn't just go up and never come back.
No, that was the resurrection. But once he ascended, he hasn't come back from his ascension, right?
I think he has.
I think
I don't think he ever left. quite
Well, maybe
frankly.
that's it, but I think there's been times in history that Jesus has come back, had to.
Well, at least the Spirit, right? And when we
Well,
talk about the
Spirit
Spirit is Jesus and God,
How
right?
did Paul get this information? Paul was he was after Jesus. He didn't
Yeah,
like
yeah,
him.
we just talked 30 years.
So,
Well, he knew the apostles. Paul knew the apostles.
yeah, but
Some of them.
he didn't like anybody. I mean, Paul was an enemy. He was an enemy.
To start with.
And all this started with Paul in the 40s, didn't it? 10
Oh,
years?
later. No,
La-
no, much more. Much
No.
more than 10 years. Close to
Yeah.
30, yeah.
Yeah, but do you really know that? Do you really know that? Because everything that I am reading, and I'm reading all medieval and right from the birth of Christianity, and I don't think that's right. I don't think it's 30 years. I think it's like 10 years that,
Oh, the stories,
Paul's-
yeah.
And I
things were-
think it, up until the last Jewish annihilation in AD 70 or whatever it was, 69.
And the temple was
70.
destroyed.
But I think in between 40 or 42 or somewhere in there and 70, that's Paul's time. There is so much written that is not biblical. People were different back in the Dark Ages, and they were very religious, and they were very smart, and they had
Now,
not
who was religious?
Bede,
Say it again?
Bede. It was a,
The Venerable Bede, yeah,
yeah, okay, I have a book on his life, and it's
Oh,
absolutely.
interesting. Oh,
I'm gonna
someday
give
you
it to
can
you
share-
as soon as I'm.
No, give us a report on it, share it with
I
us.
can't, I'm just starting in the first few chapters, but I knew who he was, and that's why I got the book from England.
You know, I loved what you said about what we're supposed to know. And maybe, as you kind of referenced, maybe we're not supposed to know everything. You know, maybe that's why the Bible is so repetitive, right? You hear stories that teach us the same thing in different ways over and over again. Love God and love one another. That's the message, and you get that when you get the Bible. But now let's go to the Gospels, because we pretty much know. How did we get the Gospels? Now, some people say that we don't know who wrote the Gospels, like the Gospel of Mark. We know it says Mark, but is it Mark? And once again, I'm going to say we don't really know if it's Mark, and if it is Mark, which Mark? Was it John Mark, who lived in Rome, or was it Mark from Syria?
When I was a young girl, many years ago, and I would go to church, and my church, it was a Methodist church, and my church didn't have a name for any of they made up these names, but it
What do
wasn't.
you mean they didn't have a name?
These Gospels, the New Testament book.
They didn't call the book, they didn't call the Gospel of Mark, Mark?
Yeah, but they didn't, they called it Mark,
Oh,
but they didn't know who Mark was. Mark,
nobody does.
it wasn't Mark that we know who Mark was. It wasn't even close. It was, nobody knew. But all of a sudden now, today, we know who Mark is.
I don't know
Well,
who Mark
he was
is.
tax collector,
Do you think Matthew, that wrote the Gospel, was a tax collector?
no.
We don't really know, but
Oh, goodness.
people are kind of saying, probably not. Probably not. He was probably a rabbi. He probably worked as a rabbi, not as
They
a,
were probably biblical people, but there were so many. Reading about religion in the Middle Ages is in another world. It's another world. It's like reading
I
Greek
think,
mythology.
I
mean,
think that's so interesting, and I made note of that. It can be absolutely shocking, disturbing, amusing to hear what other people know about your Bible. You know.
and the books they burned
Yes.
and the way they killed people. There was it was a different world than it is us sitting here today.
Wait a
know,
minute, let me think about
Nokomis
that.
and,
People being cruel,
oh,
hurting each other. Very different world back then. I'm not sure.
well,
Now, keep in mind, the Bible,
She's talking about Middle Ages.
I'm
even
talking about
before.
the Dark Ages. I'm
But-
talking
but
about,
But we still have the same cruelty, and we still have, just in different ways.
oh no,
Mm.
we don't, well, maybe sometime, slicing somebody's head off on TV that was done, but we don't have that kind of,
And it doesn't necessarily have to be here, the human race still has that kind of, I mean, I'm always appalled at wherever that may be, that people think of the things they do to hurt each other, or to punish each other, it's beyond my comprehension that people can think of the ways that they
well,
choose to
they obviously
Hurt
are
each other.
not
I don't get
God-fearing
it.
people.
Doesn't,
Hmm.
doesn't.
You know,
doesn't-
God-fearing, that came from, we're talking about wisdom statements. The beginning of wisdom, does anybody remember what is the fear
Of God.
the fear of God? Now, we don't think of fear, but it doesn't really say fear. It actually says the awe of God. You know, you're so stunned by God. And that should kind of, you know, have you ever been so awed it's terrifying?
Yeah.
But in a happy way too. You can be awed. I can't even imagine trying to know what God
It's
knows.
inexpressible
Yeah.
because of the feeling that you have. It's just like an overwhelming.
Now, we should I did want to talk about one more thing. Barabbas. We're leaving Barabbas, bless his dear heart. He's out. He made it out of the prison in exchange for Jesus, who was taken into custody in place of Barabbas. Now, we were talking about the fact, it's in all four Gospels, Barabbas is there. In all four Gospels, it means Son of God, Barabbas. And what does Jesus represent? Son of God. So there is a prisoner swap. And the idea that I said, and believe me, I just tell you what they told me in div school, didn't really happen. There's absolutely no way the Roman authorities would have put a terrorist back out in the street who was trying to destroy the Roman authority. So think of it sort of symbolically, and that the more I thought about it, the more absolute sense it made to me, because aren't we Barabbas? Didn't Jesus swap with us? We're freed of our sins, and Jesus takes responsibility, takes the punishment for our sins from us, just like Jesus took the punishment from Barabbas. And somehow that didn't make it difficult for me to believe that it might have been a symbolic story that told the truth. Jesus gave up his life for a guilty person, which is what Jesus does for me every day. Every time I make a mistake, Jesus takes responsibility for my mistakes. Fortunately, none of you have that problem because you don't make mistakes. But so let's go back to Mark for a second here. Unless you have any questions about how we're going to approach this, we're going to turn the words upside down. And we're going to look behind the words, and we're going to look for people who are there but aren't mentioned, like women and children. Children are hardly ever mentioned, worse than women. And there are plenty of children, and they're in the Bible. We just have to find them. And not necessarily by the words, but through the stories. So, are you ready? Let's go to 15, but another question.
You often talk about, some scholars say, and I wonder who those scholars are, and are they still working today?
Oh, yes.
To try to make sense of the Bible?
When I went back to divinity school, and I went back to Yale, there was a whole movement, and it was called the New Pauline Movement. And of course, it was kind of, things were changing. It's postmodern. Women were looking for women in the Bible. I want some more women's stories. Who should have been on that mountain at the Transfiguration? There should have been a woman up there, telling those guys, listen carefully, you hear God? Listen to him. Instead of relying on the three guys who were terrified, that sort of thing. So that kind of idea, and whenever you hear a story, you know there are three participants in that story: the person telling the story, the person listening to the story, and of course the person who's going to hear the person retelling the story. So we have to be responsible. And when I say some scholars, there are New Pauline scholars, there are Christian evangelists who read it word for word, and we'll see that when we get to 16. That's why some Christian evangelists deal with snakes on a regular basis on the altar in church, because it says so in the Gospel of Mark in chapter 16. And they die on a regular basis of venom poisoning because they get bit, and Mark clearly says, go ahead, get bit and you won't die. Well, they die, because they don't accept treatment. So why would anybody do that? It says so in the Bible, so we're not going to study those scholars. Best thing you can do is sort of get a feel for where you are, and then say, where would you go, Donna, if you wanted to explore this direction more? And then it would be easy for me to point you toward a cadre, a group of scholars who are working on that. There are theological philosophers, there are theological excavators, who evaluate what was dug out of the ground. This isn't just a bone, it's a blah, 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 and they usually know what they're talking about. And then there are
fakes. There's so many fakes that you're afraid. You hear scholar,
right.
and then you hear Joel Olson, and you hear that
Olstein,
group.
yes.
And then you hear the
But
the
people
ones that
love them,
speak
like
in tongues.
Joyce.
They don't know what they're talking about. I mean, and they're teaching people.
Paul spoke in tongues.
Yeah, but but that was different back then. That was not anything like what is
I
taught
don't
in
know.
the church.
I don't know.
Well, it says in the Bible, if you speak in a tongue, you have to have around you two people that understand and speak the
Interpret.
same thing.
And they can't be women, I'll bet.
No,
That
it
probably
doesn't
has to be
say
two
that.
men.
It doesn't, well, maybe it doesn't say that. But people at these churches that speak in tongues, they have no idea what they're saying, and nor does anybody that's hearing it.
Oh man, I know some people who would yell back at you.
Well, I
Probably
would
in
yell
tongues,
right back
though.
at them, because I have to rely on the Bible for my faith, and it very clearly says in the Bible, speaking in tongues, what it means and who hears it. You can go around babbling anything you want. Does that mean anything? It means nothing.
Interesting.
And people are crazy. People that are crazy do that.
Oh my goodness.
I always think of speaking in tongues as a gift when it's a gift, because I also know that you have to have somebody who can interpret it. It doesn't mean anything if you're just
Babbling.
But it's the gift that you have of being able to speak in other languages, because not everybody can do that. Not everybody can learn a new language and be fluent in it and actually get their thoughts across fluidly. And so I always think of that. For me, that's
Yeah,
the gift
that's
of tongues,
totally
is being
different
able
than
to learn other languages.
that learning a language and speaking in tongues.
All right,
Um,
let's think about that. Let's think about that as we get back into this, because we'll be in Mark for absolutely ever. Let's look, Pilate wanted to satisfy the crowd so that they would shut up and settle down. So Pilate did what the crowd wanted him to do. He released Barabbas. And then Mark says, then he had Jesus flogged. And then he turned Jesus over to be crucified. And I think that's around 15, verse 15. Mark says that so casually, right? He just leaves out all the emotion. He just writes, and then he had Jesus flogged. But we shouldn't think that what Jesus is about to experience is something simple or casual, because we shouldn't think there was anything easy about it. Do you know what flogging actually is? We just read it in verse 15, but Mark didn't write about the process. He just said Jesus was flogged. So what really happened? Well, here's what really happened. Are you ready? It's not pleasant. First thing that happened was the Roman soldiers who were in charge of this stripped all of Jesus's clothes off of him. And then they led him to a spot where they could tie his hands to a post above his head. And then they got the whip. And the whip was called a flagellum. Flagellum, I don't know if you've ever seen one, but it consisted of several long pieces of leather that were cut in strips. And then they were bundled together. And each of the strips had pieces of bone or lead embedded at the end of the strips. And usually there were 2 floggers. So 2 flagellums, 2 men, one on each side of Jesus, or on the one being flogged, because this was a very difficult job. It was exhausting. So one flogger would tire out before the damage was done. So usually there were 2 floggers. So this heavy weighted whip was brought down with full force again and again against Jesus' shoulders and across his back and across the backs of his legs. And at first, the thongs cut through the skin only. But as the floggers kept flogging, the flagellum cut deeper into the subcutaneous tissue, which is the hypodermis tissue, that layer of fat under your skin. So at first the flogging produced blood because the capillaries and the veins of the skin are broken, so they're bleeding. But with more flogging, Jesus's body would be squirting arterial blood from the muscles under the skin, until finally the skin on his back would be hanging in loose ribbons, and you couldn't even recognize it as a back because it just looked like a bloody mass of mangled tissue. And doctors say today, and these are theological doctors, we do have scientific medical theologians, that the muscle damage and the blood loss made this condition worse than suffering from 3rd-degree burns. So no surprise to learn that victims of flogging almost never survived the flogging. They died of blood loss and physical and emotional trauma. And it's also said confidently by experts who study these punishments. There are scholars, experts who study ancient punishments. Don't let them date your grandchildren, right? That flogging is one of the most violent and inhumane forms of physical abuse known to man. And the Romans were great at it. They had it down to a science. So, on that note, let's look at verse 16.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Why, if Pilate was so reluctant to some degree, he kept trying to give him an out, right? Why you gotta take this guy? He hasn't done anything, blah, blah. Why would he have turned around? I get it that he said, okay, this is what you guys are screaming for, I'll give him to you. But why did he have to add the flogging?
A
What was-
couple of
Do
reasons.
they know?
Yeah, there are opinions, I don't know if
Right.
anybody knows, a couple of reasons. First of all, bloodlust. You have a crowd that's screaming, we want his blood, we want him crucified now. So the hope, people say, is that Pilate was hoping that, number one, Jesus would die before he had to deal with him, or number two, the crowd would get their bloodlust satisfied and Jesus would survive, he wouldn't have to be crucified. That was the hope. Some say.
I don't remember,
Wow.
I don't remember how many lashes it was, but I know that I've read someplace that there were only a certain number of lashes that most
40.
people survived.
40, but that's not mentioned, in Mark's gospel. I think Luke is very physical, you know, the doctor, he knows. But Jesus did survive the flogging. So Mark says, the soldiers led Jesus away to the courtyard of the governor's residence, and we're not exactly sure where that was. But we can be pretty certain that the soldiers dragged Jesus or carried him. He couldn't have walked because of his wounds. His legs were damaged. So once they were in the courtyard with Jesus, then Pilate called everyone together, and then right in front of everyone, the soldiers dressed the naked Jesus. And what did they put on him?
Purple robe.
Purple. Dressed him in purple, maybe. Maybe it was purple, or maybe it was scarlet, because if you read Matthew dresses him in scarlet, which there's a whole other story about why it's red and not.
A lot of men can't tell the difference.
I know, they can't tell.
Was he flogged in the public? In public?
Oh, yeah. The flogging was in public, absolutely. Everything, because these were used as warnings to the population. This is what happens to you when you try to disturb the peace of Rome. It's deterrent. But then, as if the flogging, then what did they do to Jesus?
Made him walk.
They
the
walked, he
cross.
got there, they put him in a purple robe, and then what they put on him?
Spit on him and hit him
Yeah,
with the
Crown.
crown of
they
thorns.
crowned Jesus with,
Thorns.
Mark calls it a garland of woven thorns. And he'd already been through so much anguish, right? Starting from Gethsemane, all that trauma and the fear and the anxiety, terror. And then the pain of the flogging, which is agony beyond comprehension. And then the purple robe. But does anybody know why Mark says the robe was purple?
It's the royal
Royalty.
color.
Royalty, exactly. We think we know the color of the garment was purple, and we think it was a robe, sort of a tunic. We don't know if it was linen or wool or silk, but Mark says it was in fact purple. And you know who Alice Walker is, right?
They're called purple.
National treasure, right? She's still alive. She lives in North Carolina now. And she wrote a book, it's one of my favorite books,
Called
The
purple.
Color Purple.
Oh,
But
yes.
it's
Oh,
not the story of the Passion. But maybe she gives us an idea of why the color purple is in our story today. I just thought it was so prescient. Now, of course, we know the facts you all mentioned. In first century Israel, purple was a color reserved for royalty, probably because it was so rare and so expensive. You had to get these special mollusks, like clams, but they weren't clams. They were more like mussels. They looked more like mussels. And you had to boil them a certain way, and you had to extract this dye, and it took so many mussels to get a fabric dyed purple. They were hard to find, hard to extract, so it was a very special color. that cost a lot, so reserved for royalty. So we can see that the soldiers are mocking Jesus by putting him in purple. Remember when Pilate says, "What are you, king of the Jews?" So that's how the soldiers are mocking him, that he could possibly be a king. But Alice Walker has a whole other take on the color purple, and I really love it. She ponders through one of the characters in her book, Shug, right? And she gets us thinking too about Jesus. She writes, "Have you ever noticed that the color purple is rather rare in the natural world? There aren't a lot of things that actually grow purple." So Walker warns us, when you walk by purple flowers, or you walk by a field of purple, like lavender when it's in bloom, you better make note of it. You better notice it, or else God will be pissed, really annoyed that you didn't appreciate the color purple that he put there for you. It's a reminder, I can do this, so notice. And everyone knows it's not good to annoy God. So we're supposed to appreciate the gift of the color purple. So maybe that's what God is telling the crowd concerning Jesus dressed in purple. We should notice him. But have you noticed that I don't know if you've read the other Passion stories, but not all the gospel writers dress Jesus in purple. Mark does, but Matthew puts him in scarlet, and we'll talk about that when we get to Matthew's gospel. But no matter what the color, the dressing and the crowning are more examples of group cruelty, group shaming, publicly displayed, that's supposed to humiliate Jesus. And so you can see that in verse 18. The soldiers are taunting Jesus. They yell at him, "Greetings, King of the Judeans," and they keep hitting him on the head with a staff. Now he's got the crown on his head. His body's just torn up. But if you read some of the translations of Mark, and I'm curious, what does it say in your Bible in verse 18? What are the soldiers using to hit Jesus on the head?
They just say a stick in mine.
A stick,
A staff?
a staff. Does anybody read a
Staff.
reed?
Mine's a staff also.
A staff, interesting. But you can see the difference between a staff and a reed. A staff is like,
Substantial.
it's a wooden, like a walking stick, a wooden stick. And you can see walkers today, they use sometimes one in each hand. I thought they used it for balance, but apparently it's for exercise for your upper body. You walk with a staff, but back in the day it was used for protection, like a weapon. You could bat a robber out of your way, or a wolf, or a mountain lion. But a reed, you know what a reed is. It's sort of like a long piece of grass, right? Hollow, like a pool noodle almost, right? That was useless for protection. But if the soldiers are constantly hitting Jesus on the head, it was probably with a reed and not with a staff. Can we see that? Interesting. We try to make Jesus suffer even more than he's already suffering.
I don't know
But-
how we separate.
I know. And how many times could reasonably we expect Jesus to be hit on the head with a wooden staff? Not many. But a reed, that would work. Not to kill someone, but to taunt someone, to bother them, aggravate, humiliate them, which is what they do in verse 19. They spit on him. They spit for a purpose. spitting is not a symbolic act here in Mark's gospel. It's real. It shows contempt for that person, complete disrespect. Now, we take spitting very seriously in the United States of America. I looked it up. It's still a crime. Spitting on someone, at least for now it is. When I was watching some of those demonstrations, and just recently, well, kids, and I know I shouldn't be doing this, giving kids a pass, but just recently at one of those gatherings where kids get together and race their cars and go in and harass store owners and the like, that they do in the summertime because they have nothing else to do, spitting on a police officer. It's a crime. You can be arrested for it. And if you have friends or relatives in law enforcement, you know how that makes them feel. First of all, it's absolutely disgusting and potentially dangerous because sputum carries pathogens, right? And can spread diseases like TB and COVID, but it's also battery, it's assault, it's humiliation, disrespect. Showed that do you think that spitting is a way to show that you disagree strongly with the person on whom you are spitting?
No, I think it's stronger than that.
I think it's stronger.
Really?
I disagree with you. No. I think you can say I disagree with you and walk away.
Yeah, or even punch somebody.
Oh, interesting.
It's like a physical,
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
It's battery. That's what it's
Mhm.
called, battery.
My husband was spit on at a McDonald's when he got back from.
From Vietnam. He was, oh my
boy.
goodness. Oh my
Oh.
goodness. But I suppose
Was he in
it's
uniform?
better.
How would he have known?
Short hair.
Oh
He
my
just thought,
goodness.
there's a guy with short hair, I'm gonna spit on him. Wow.
It was in
cow.
San Diego.
You know, I grew up in New York, and Hasidim, with the payas and the hats, and people would spit on a Jew because they thought they didn't have the right to be here. You know, what are you doing in my country? And it's kind of happening again in New York, in my hometown. But I do think it's better to spit on a person than to shoot the person
Yes.
in the back or in the neck, right?
Mhm.
But
or anywhere.
yeah,
Yeah.
Please,
Pick a
anyway.
place.
Pick a place, yeah.
yeah, gosh.
It's okay to shoot them in the arm or,
Or even shoot in
leg.
his direction, I think.
yeah.
It's
Isn't
better.
that Shakespearean time, and in the writings, they'd stab him in the buttocks with a knife. It was better than stabbing him in the chest. If you wanted to
It
insult
would
him,
go in.
you stabbed him in the rear end, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that's kind of true today. Like if you watch some of these movies and TV shows, it's always kind of humorous if you get shot in the buttocks.
For
Embarrassed, yeah, embarrassment. I thought you were gonna say because you get stuck in bone here, where they are.
Oh,
At least my behind it would go in a long, long way. But, oh my goodness, to get back to the reality, after the soldiers spit on Jesus, then they began to bow down to him, just to mock him. They got down on their knees and pretended that they were showing homage, but they were just
That's
making
terrible.
fun of him, and they thought it was hilarious. And other people did too. Other people stood around, bullying, right? It's heartbreaking. If you've been a teacher, you've been a witness to bullying, and your heart breaks for the bullier and the bullied. And that's what happens with group shaming, and it's so dangerous because it's so contagious. So when it is not stopped, it usually leads to more violent behavior. Here in Jerusalem, finally, the soldiers stopped spitting and taunting. And then they took the purple robe off of Jesus and they dressed him in his regular clothes and then they led him away to be crucified. Now, Mark never mentions it, but in your mind, when you're visualizing this scene, Jesus is back in that one-piece tunic that had no seams, remember? But do you think Jesus was still wearing his crown of thorns? Or do you think they took that off?
I don't know, I think I've always seen him pictured with it on.
On?
I would think it would have fell off at some point.
That's what I'm thinking. Unless it's stuck into the.
Yeah.
I
Flush.
know, I know.
Mhm.
Which of course the crown of thorns was just another way that the Roman soldiers were mocking Jesus, showing their contempt. The crown is a symbol of authority, but obviously not this crown. It was there for humiliation, and it was very, very cruel. It wasn't placed there just to humiliate Jesus, it was placed there to hurt him. Because thorns, if you've ever seen the crowns, crown of thorns, those thorns are quite long, and they were driven into his scalp, and you know, if you get a scalp wound, it bleeds profusely, because there's so much blood in your scalp, which is there to protect your brain, right? And to regulate your temperature, which protects your brain, which is your power supply. And it's very, very sensitive to pain. And the soldiers knew that, everyone knew that. So they were just making sure that Jesus would suffer more, not just the emotional pain, but the
Unbelievable.
physical pain. Yeah, and then that blood pouring down, that was just an extra added attraction.
Of course, the soldiers were performing for the crowd also.
Absolutely. And you know how that happens, you know, you throw one a bone, they want more, so you do more, they want more. Public shaming, it's horrific. And it gets to the point where it's completely out of control. So now here's Jesus with the blood pouring down from his head into his face, into his eyes. It's practically impossible for him to walk, impossible practically. But Mark doesn't say it was impossible. He infers that Jesus was trying to walk, he was stumbling. So we'll stop here, but I'm going to put my little note. Start here, because you guys never remember
1521.
our Savior. Yeah. Because the Romans have to ask for help, and it's a very interesting ask. We'll talk about the guy they asked. Interesting fellow, and why did Mark put the guy there, you know, and we'll talk about that next week. But in terms of what we talked about today, when you hear Mark's description of this horrific scene, the flogging, the humiliation, do you feel confident, trustworthy that that's what happened?
I don't think anyone would make up that horrific of a story and tell it of their Lord. I think it's the truth.
Especially, we're assuming that Mark is a Christian, right? A follower of Christ. Imagine telling a story like this on someone that you follow, that you respect, that you love, that you would die for, and he's just mocked to smithereens, you know. No one would make that up, right? Somehow you expect Jesus to, you know, whip off that purple robe and there's a big S on his chest, da da da. You know, you can imagine that kind of a story. But a story, you worship that guy? What are you, nuts? You know, which is when you said scholars believe that you probably wouldn't tell a story like that unless it was pretty much true. So I'm comfortable that a lot of different different versions of it, because when Matthew tells it to his community, and when Luke tells it, but wait till we get to John. John's my favorite. He tells it because Jesus really does have a big S on his chest in John. He's triumphant in John, but he's had 100 years to get that way. John writes last. So, yeah, his people don't know the real story firsthand from somebody who knows somebody who actually saw it. In Mark's community, somebody saw those stories, and that doesn't happen, and not in Luke's either. Time had gone too far by. So please send me. I don't have a question so far for next week. So what we'll do is we'll finish 15, and when we get to 16, there's the real 16 that Mark wrote, and then and you'll see there are only 9 verses that are attributed to Mark in chapter 16. The rest of it are additions that were added in much later manuscripts, and I'm talking 100 to 200 years later, that were added. And once again, talking about storytelling. Wait a minute, that's the end of the story? Oh, no. Here's what I heard really happened, so we'll look at that. And I think they're still instructive and edifying and gracious. So thank you all. Send me your questions and concerns. I hope you're having happy summer.